Since the independence of the United States, human traffickers in the North were heavily engaged in the Atlantic slave trade. Then in 1787, South Carolina's legislature imposed a ban on the importation of African captives for the purpose of slavery. The U.S. Congress ignored this ban, and continued to import African slaves for the next 20 years, until 1807. That's when they announced that the Atlantic slave trade would officially end in 1808. This created a mad dash for human traffickers to bring as many slaves into the U.S. before the clock ran out. Although South Carolina was not accepting any slaves, the slave traders blatantly used the port of Charleston as their entry point, shipping slaves into the South and the new territories in the West. Now that the Atlantic slave trade was abolished, the slave trading companies shifted their focus toward the domestic slave trade. Headquartered in northern states such as Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C., these human traffickers shuffled enslaved individuals across the South during the early 1800s. Many families were broken up because of this practice, but the northern slave traders were only concerned with making a profit. Some were known to kidnap free blacks in the North, and sell them as slaves in the Deep South. After the War of 1812, many ports seemed especially vulnerable to foreign attack, so the Union offered to safeguard Charleston Bay from fortresses such as Fort Moultrie and Castle Pinckney. In 1829, construction of Fort Sumter began on a sandbar in the middle of Charleston Bay. Although the Industrial Revolution was growing in the North, it was the South's production of cotton, tobacco, and sugar which brought wealth into the United States. The North, which controlled much of the human trafficking, also controlled shipping of the materials produced in the South. For example, they would buy cotton in the South at 20 cents a pound, and sell it to European traders for $1.89 a pound. But that wasn't enough. The North also imposed protective tariffs, to encourage the South to purchase goods from the northern U.S. states, instead of importing them from overseas. When South Carolina declared this interference of free trade unconstitutional, the North threatened to use military force against them. Upon writing the Force Bill of 1833, President Jackson sent the Navy to intercept any cargo ships which weren't approved by the Union from entering Charleston Bay. Also, the Union Army was already positioned in Fort Moultrie and Castle Pinckney. South Carolina tried to compromise, and accepted the Union's plans to gradually lower tariffs over the next 10 years. What other choice did they have? The Union Army and Navy had cannons pointed at Charleston. In spite of this, the tariffs continued to grow from 11% in 1830 to 48% in 1860. Thanks to the success of the cotton gin, the need for slave labor to harvest cotton increased. But in 1850, a mechanical harvester was patented. This machine could take the place of 100 men. However, it was withheld from production, because it would free millions of blacks, allowing them to migrate into northern cities. In 1857, Dred Scott attempted to sue for his freedom, but the federal courts ruled against him, saying that blacks were not citizens, and didn't have legal rights. Meanwhile in the South, many slaves were allowed to buy their freedom. By 1860, South Carolina declared that the North was refusing to adhere to the rules of the U.S. Constitution. They openly opposed the North's military threats and the tariffs. However, Congress declared that any state in the Union would be guilty of treason for opposing federal laws. The only choice of action was for South Carolina to secede from the Union, and conduct itself as a separate, sovereign territory. The Union Army attempted to occupy the nearly completed Fort Sumter, and ignored orders to vacate for several months. Then the Confederate militia spotted a Northern ship attempting to bring reinforcements to Fort Sumter. Sensing this threat, the Confederate militia fired, and forced it to turn back. They also fired on Fort Sumter, forcing the Union Army out. It's well documented that the Confederate states who joined with South Carolina's secession, also declared the tariffs an abomination. By April 1861, 8 states seceded from the Union. The Union declared war, and used battleships to block the South from engaging in free trade, in what is known as the Anaconda Plan. Cutting off supplies left the South vulnerable. But the Union faced a dilemma. It needed to continue to export the South's cotton, while simultaneously discouraging Europeans from becoming involved. Their solution was to claim they were fighting to end slavery. It wasn't until 1862 that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Just 5 months earlier, the Union devised a new way to extort money from the South, since human trafficking and protective tariffs were failing. So in August 1861, Lincoln imposed the first federal income tax, which declared anyone who earned over $800 a year would pay 5% of their income to the government. This had no effect on Northern factory workers, because they made less than $500 per year. On the other hand, the federal government set out to rename the slaves sharecroppers, in order to consider them wage earners who were eligible for the tax. Whether or not they were actually paid was irrelevant. The Union simply declared that 1/3 of a plantation's profits would be allocated as the workers' wages. If a plantation made $150,000, then 1/3 or $50,000 would be divided among the 50 sharecroppers. The records would show each individual earning $1,000, which is above the $800 minimum. So once again, the Union found a way to extort the South. To further gain sympathy for the practice, the Union began accusing the South of abusing blacks. They would distribute political cartoons showing slaves being whipped and forced to work in chains. There were also accusations of rape and forced breeding, as well as blaming the South for breaking up families, which I described earlier when I discussed the Northern slave traders and the domestic slave trade. Any money extorted from the South was used to help the Union's war effort, including Sherman's march through the South, killing, burning and looting anything of value. The Union Army stole money, jewelry, rifles, swords, silverware, watches, etc. The majority of Civil War battles occurred in the South, and ultimately cost the lives of over 600,000 men. Most Union soldiers had no idea what they were actually fighting for, and people are still misinformed today. After General Lee surrendered, and the federal government accomplished the goal of taxing Southern blacks, they made sure that there would be no migration of black people into the North or to the West. Previously, it had been the Fugitive Slave Act which restricted black people to the South, but now it was sharecroppers' debt laws which kept black people restricted to the South. They were promised freedom, 40 acres and a mule, but most were sent to the east coast of Georgia and Florida, and were not allowed to venture west of St. Johns River. Now that black people were officially free citizens, the U.S. Congress was obligated to provide adequate representation for Southern states, based on population. However, that would have given the South political leverage, so the North rejected that proposal. It took several negotiations, and the federal government finally agreed on a compromise, counting 3/5 of blacks as citizens for the purposes of congressional representation for the South. Black people still weren't allowed to vote, so any argument about the South wanting to lower the count due to a conflict of interest is nonsense.